Others said he looked like Joseph Smith, that he was a man over now 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair, portly stature, and others even wrote that he was dressed in white. Now notice, there were several journal keepers. Afterwards, a vote was called for. When Brigham Young spoke, he had indicated that the keys for leading the church rested with the 12. When a vote was called for, it was unanimous that the 12 lead the church. In the next session that was held in the afternoon, Brigham Young had some disparaging things to say about Sidney Rigdon. In fact, he said that if Sidney continues to want to be Joseph's counselor, then he needs to go where Joseph is. So, with that, how did Sidney ever get a splinter group when you'd say that the saints were unanimous behind the 12? Well, Sidney was pretty tricky. He started going door to door. As he did so, he talked about the meeting that was held in the grove by the temple. As he talked about it, he invited the people to tell him what they had seen in the countenance of Brigham Young. As by one they talked about they heard Joseph's voice, they saw him. Sidney's next line had much to do with, "Aren't you amazed at the power of Satan to deceive?" Then Sidney would indicate that the angel had told him that the majority of the church would follow the 12, but only the elect. Today we'd probably say the special, but back then they said the elect. Only the elect would know that Sidney was to be the guardian. Everybody at some point in their lives wants to be more special than their neighbor or the person sitting next to them. My, that's a tricky line that Sidney used. The result was he literally took hundreds, but notice it's just a splinter out of Nauvoo. He took them to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he founded his church, the Church of Jesus Christ, which, by the way, still has remnants today. As he established his church, you get most of his writings from a newspaper that he publishes in his church called the Messenger and Advocate, much like we had a newspaper in the early days in the church in Kirtland called the Messenger and Advocate. There, Sidney talks about the doctrine as he believes it. However, Sidney's church goes through many transformations, many different splinter groups. Why is that? Why is it so small today, only a handful, just in the hundreds? Why is it so small? And the answer is, Sidney made a very strategic mistake. His mistake was he kept announcing the day of the millennium and when it would begin. Those who followed him would then sell all their goods and their homes and all they possessed and go to where Sidney was, his own type of church. They would practice jumping as if they were going to be caught up in some amazing rapture with heavenly beings. Then when night would go into day and there was nothing different, home they would go and a new splinter group formed. Sidney announced the millennium not once, not twice, but to be ushering in of the millennium 3 different times. What's the sad part of the story? Well, you realize any loss from the truth that someone goes through is a sad story. For Sidney, he and his posterity will die outside of the loyalty and faith found in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In his fall, he will take many with him. If you were to say, is this a stone cut out without hands that rolls forth and will fill the whole earth? I'd say no. This church, it needs a jump start. It's not rolling forth fast at all. In fact, it's diminishing year after year until now just a couple hundred. Well, that's one of the early splinter groups that forms, and I suppose the choice is there for some. Another one forms by a man whose name is James Strang. Now, James Strang doesn't have the history in the church that Sidney Rigdon had. In other words, he doesn't join the church till February 1844, just a few months before Joseph dies. But James Strang is a fascinating character to read about. He was born into a family in which his father was an itinerant Baptist preacher. He was born into a family you'd say had French origins. They had come to America. They basically were poor farmers living in the East. And you'd say, but for him, as was the prophet Joseph, for James Strang, who was born in 1813, he was born at a time when we're talking about such things as the common man becoming as great as even being president of the United States. It's a time of Andrew Jackson, where people in America were starting to call themselves ladies and gentlemen. And those in England were saying, how dare you upstarts call yourselves such things. Women were starting to name their children. Well, have you ever heard of the name of King Follett? It was like women would name their children what they wanted them to be when they grew up, because after all, you could be anything you wanted, even a King Follett. Or even a Dr. Herbert, an ultimate anti-Mormon in church history, but his mother wanted him to be a doctor, so he got that title. There was a Lord Sterling. And for James Strang, his goal in life was one day to have royalty. Lucky for the historians, James Strang, as a young man, kept a journal. It's fun to read as he pens when he's 19 years old that he's still a common farmer. And by this point, he should have been elected to some kind of assembly or brigadier general if he's ever to rival Caesar or Napoleon, which he has vowed to do. By the early 20s, he is writing that he's spent all day trying to muse and ponder about how he can marry someone who will be the Queen of England so he can be the king. By the 1830s, when the Carolinas are talking about seceding from the United States, he writes, what a horrible thing, but perhaps this will be the way that will open up, that he can be the next president. So with this mania that is his for great power and authority, with great sadness, he writes in his 20s, he marries a common girl who is only 18 years old, and they begin a family. He's a teacher for a time, but his favorite book is the book about the life of Napoleon. As a teacher, he finally concludes that he can't be a teacher because it just isn't good for his health. He then decides that he'll study a little bit, and he becomes a lawyer in New York. Pretty soon he's elected to be a postmaster. He has some village assignments, but nothing very big. And then comes a day when James Strang moves to Wisconsin. When he moves to Wisconsin, he learns that there is a prophet in Nauvoo named Joseph Smith. He goes to visit the prophet Joseph in February of 1844. On February 25th, 1844, Joseph Smith baptizes James Strang in the font there at the Nauvoo Temple. James Strang concluded that after the baptism, Joseph blessed him, that he would be greater than Moses, Elijah, and that he would walk and talk and see God face to face. Now, James Strang returned home. As Sidney Rigdon claimed that he saw an angel on June 27, 1844, so did James Strang. My, that angel was busy, wasn't he? So James Strang claimed that the angel told him that Joseph was now dead and that he was to be the new leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For James Strang, he also claimed that as Joseph Smith wrote his last journal entry on June 18, 1844, his last journal entry was about how he loved his brother Hiram, that Joseph Smith then wrote a letter to James Strang. What are the chances? Absolutely zero. But James Strang claimed that he had a letter in which Joseph wrote to him that he was to be the new president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that the new gathering place for the saints would be a place called Borey, Wisconsin, which in his mind, Borey means Garden of Peace. Now, James Strang went to a church in Michigan and read the letter. As he read the letter, a branch president stood up and denounced him. James Strang came reeling back at this branch president and said he had no right to condemn someone who had been appointed by God. Well, the result was the branch president immediately excommunicated James Strang. But James Strang had got some followers from that meeting.